You know, history is packed with some pretty wild stories, but honestly, few are as jaw-droppingly improbable as this one. It's the story of how a teenage peasant girl who claims she spoke directly to God somehow managed to turn the tide of a war that had been raging for a century and literally save her country. Today we're diving deep into the incredible story of Joan of Arc and the Siege of Orleans.
So to really get what makes Joan's story so incredible, you've got to understand just how desperate things were. The year is 1429. This conflict that we now call the 100 Years' War has been going on for generations. It started out as a squabble over who should be king, but had turned into this brutal, all-out war of conquest. France, which was actually the richer kingdom, was being just systematically torn apart by a much more organized and frankly superior English army.
Morale in France? It was completely in the gutter. Their armies were beaten, their leaders were fighting amongst themselves, and their rightful king hadn't even been crowned yet. Defeat looked like he was just around the corner. And this sets up the central, almost unbelievable question of this whole story. Could one illiterate teenager from a tiny village really change the fate of an entire nation?
Okay, so let's set the stage and look at the strategic situation. By 1428, the outlook for France was, well, it was about as bleak as it could possibly get. The English weren't just winning, they were absolutely dominating.
I mean, look at this situation. It was absolutely dire. The English and their allies, the Burgundians, they controlled almost all of northern France, and that includes Paris. They'd even declared their own baby king, Henry VI, as the King of France. The actual French heir, the Dauphin Charles, was so weak people mockingly called him the King of Bourges, because that was pretty much all he had left. He was a king without a kingdom, a king without a crown.
And smack dab in the middle of this whole strategic nightmare was one city, Orléans. It sits right on the Loire River, and it was the last major city in the north that was still loyal to Charles. It was the final barrier stopping the English from just rolling south and crushing what was left of France. Seriously, if Orléans fell, the war was over. Game, set, match for England.
And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, well, it did. In February of 1429, a French and Scottish force tried to attack an English supply convoy. Now, this convoy was carrying a bunch of salted fish, herring, for Lent, so this fight gets the ridiculous name, the Battle of the Herrings, but there was nothing funny about it. The French attack was a total disaster, a humiliating defeat that just completely shattered what little hope they had left. The commanders were pointing fingers, and Charles was apparently thinking about just fleeing the country altogether.
And it's right here, at this absolute rock-bottom moment, when all seems completely lost, that our hero steps onto the stage. Just as France was drowning in despair, the most improbable glimmer of hope imaginable appeared. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc. You probably know her as Joan of Arc. She's a 17-year-old from a small village, and for years she'd been having these visions. She claimed the voices of saints were speaking to her, giving her a very specific two-part mission. First, break the English siege of Orléans, and second, lead the Dauphin to the city of Reims to be crowned the one true King of France.
Now, as you can imagine, this was not an easy pitch. Hi, I'm a teenager, and God wants me to lead your army. Her first try was basically laughed out of the room, but she didn't give up. In February 1429, right as news of that disastrous Battle of the Herrings was spreading, she finally wore down a local captain who gave her an escort. She travels for 11 days through hostile territory to get to the Dauphin's court. Charles is, of course, super skeptical, so he has her grilled by theologians. But in the end, they basically concluded, hey, things are so bad, what have we got to lose?
So Charles gives her armor, a banner, and command of a small army. And what's the very first thing she does? She sends an unbelievably bold letter to the English commanders. No diplomacy, no negotiation. It was a direct order in God's name, telling them to pack their bags and get out of France for good. The English commanders, of course, thought she was a crazy person, just a sign of how desperate the French really were. They had no idea what was about to hit them.
All right, so that brings us right to the city walls. The English had been sitting outside Orléans for 6 long months, slowly building this network of forts to starve the city into surrender. And then, Joan showed up.
On April 29th, Joan and her troops managed to slip right through the English lines and get into Orléans. The effect was absolutely electric. Think about it. For months, the people in the city felt totally alone and abandoned. And then suddenly, this maiden in shining armor, who they'd heard prophecies about, arrives with food, soldiers, and this overwhelming sense of divine hope.
Morale, which had been at rock bottom, just skyrocketed overnight. See, Joan wasn't about to sit around and wait for things to happen. She immediately started pushing for an attack. The old, cautious French commanders were hesitant, but her energy was just infectious. On May 4th, they storm an English fort. Bam! It falls. 2 days later, they take another one. In just a few days, the entire dynamic of the siege had completely flipped. The French were on the attack, and they were winning. But the real make-or-break moment came on May 7th, during the attack on Les Tourelles, which was the absolute key to the entire English position. Joan was right there in the thick of it, leading from the front, when a longbow arrow hit her, piercing right through her armor between her neck and shoulder.
The word spreads like wildfire through the French ranks. The witch is dead. And you could feel the morale just start to plummet. But Joan, after someone literally pulled the arrow out and slapped some olive oil on the wound, did the unthinkable. She got up and went right back to the front line. Seeing her alive, holding her banner, the exhausted French soldiers found a second wind, and they launched one last furious charge.
And that final charge, it was just too much for the English defenders. The French swarmed the fortress. The English commander even fell from a burning bridge and drowned in the river below. The English losses were staggering, almost 1,000 men killed or captured on that one single day.
So the next morning, the English army that's left forms up, ready for a big final battle. The French march out to meet them, and they just stand there, staring at each other for about an hour. And then, the English, their command structure a mess and their whole position destroyed, just turned around and marched away. The siege that had lasted for 6 months was broken just 9 days after Joan arrived. Unbelievable.
But here's the thing. Lifting the siege? That was only part 1 of Joan's mission. Part 2 was just as critical, and maybe even more daring.
That win at Orléans wasn't just a military victory, it was a total game-changer, psychologically. The English aura of being unbeatable was completely shattered. Riding this new wave of confidence, Joan's army launched what's now called the Loire campaign, just blitzing through the region, taking back key towns, and winning a massive victory at the Battle of Patay that absolutely crippled the main English army.
With the way cleared, Joan leads the Dauphin deep into enemy territory to the city of Reims, the traditional place where French kings were crowned. And on July 17, 1429, Charles was officially crowned King Charles VII of France, and standing right there beside him was Joan of Arc. The second part of her divine mission was complete. He wasn't the king of Bourges anymore. He was God's chosen king for all of France.
Now we know Joan's personal story doesn't have a happy ending. About a year later, she was captured, sold to the English, put through a sham trial, and burned at the stake. But her impact, her legacy, well, that's still something people argue about. What exactly was her role in all these incredible victories?
So, what are we to make of her? This is where historians really get into it. Was she a secret military genius, actually planning the strategies and directing the troops? Or was she more of an inspirational mascot? In this second view, her real talent wasn't military, it was psychological. By convincing everyone this was a holy war, she gave the French a powerful reason to fight and completely shattered their feeling of inferiority. As one historian neatly put it, her impact was maybe militarily minimal, but politically critical.
So if we boil it all down, what are the big takeaways here? First, she was the ultimate unlikely hero, showing up when all hope was gone. Second, her arrival completely changed the psychology of the entire war. Third, she pulled off a series of victories that were just unthinkable weeks earlier. Fourth, her actions are what made the coronation of King Charles possible, which was hugely important. And finally, even though she was captured and killed, her actions and her legacy were the real turning point that led to France eventually winning the whole war. And that brings us back to the big question that still hangs over this story. What really saved Orléans? Was it a divine miracle? A stroke of tactical genius from an unexpected source? Or was it just the single greatest morale boost in the history of warfare? Maybe the real answer is a little bit of all three, but it really makes you think about what it takes to actually change the course of history. Thanks for watching.